Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
Doing well. Doing well. Just wrapping the year up here. We got
Yeah.
snow on the ground. Santa Claus is coming, and we're gonna talk about taxes today.
Hey, why not? Why not? It seems festive. Yeah.
Nothing like Christmas and taxes.
Taxes, death, and inheritance. We're going to hit them all
There you
today.
go.
Yeah,
All the certainties of life.
that's right.
So this episode kind of comes out of some changes that happened in the Secure Act, and kind of what has been portrayed in the media as the death of the stretch IRA.
Yes.
And it's interesting because all of the Secure Act stuff, a lot of it happened during the pandemic and COVID. And
Yeah.
so a lot of it really kind of got glossed over in terms of like, hey, there's this thing, but we really didn't think
Right.
about the impact and what we're going to do and how it's going to impact people. And now we're kind of coming back around and saying, hey, this is something you probably should pay attention
Yeah.
to a little bit more.
Yeah, it was paired with the move from 70 and a half to 73 for
Mm-hmm.
required minimum distribution age, which caught everybody's attention. Well, anybody, in that window, and was very salient right away. But the way they paid for it, or one of the ways they paid for that, is by changing the rules on inherited IRAs. And the other aspect where it kind of got lost for a little while is it took the IRS a while to issue good guidance on how they were going to
Right?
implement the rules. Some of it
Yeah.
was just figured out last year and is only just this year taking effect.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those with the Secure Act. They put a lot of stuff in there, and then they kind of said, "All right, IRS, you go figure this out from here," right?
Right. Right.
And so there was, it's why it's kind of taken a while. But essentially, what we're talking about here is it used to be as the beneficiary of an IRA, you had the ability to stretch those payments over your lifetime, right? And
Right.
so you had to take a required minimum distribution every year, but that was based off of your age and life
Yes.
expectancy and could go on really until you were 120, according to the
Right.
the IRS tables, right?
We should clarify here that we're talking about non-spouse beneficiaries.
Correct. Yes.
So, husband or wife inheriting an IRA from each other can treat it as their own.
Yep. And so what we're talking about in the past, this used to be anybody had these privileges for the most part, right?
Right.
And now it has changed where only eligible designated beneficiaries have the ability to stretch out their payments over their lifetime, right? And
Right.
so that can be a surviving spouse of the IRA or plan owner, a minor child. There's some special rules for minor children. There is another is individual who's disabled, or who is chronically ill, or an individual who is not more than 10 years younger than the IRA owner still has that privilege of
Yes.
stretching out those distributions.
Yeah.
For everyone else, the entire balance has to be distributed by the end of the 10th year. And I think there's different rules for entities like charities and things like that.
Yes.
Although charities usually take it all out right away because they don't pay taxes. So,
Exactly. Yeah. So the bottom line is if you are leaving an IRA to your children,
mhm.
as a good example, they're probably going to deal with a more complicated set of tax planning issues than they would have pre 2019.
Yeah. And so part of the issue, and kind of why we're bringing it up and talking about it today, is most people who, if you have children, they are generally your contingent beneficiary. So usually it's your spouse and then your children. And what happens is a lot of times, and kind of what we're seeing is as people die, their children are, in their 50s and 60s, and they're a
Yeah.
lot of times
Prime
still
earning years.
working,
Yeah.
and they're in their prime earning years. And so they might have much higher tax brackets.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden they get this, IRA balances have gone up, the market's been great. And so we're seeing bigger
Yeah.
numbers in these pre tax accounts, and then all of a sudden you've got a kid that's doing well, making a couple $100,000 a year, inherits a $1 million IRA and now has to take $100,000 a year, or at the end of the 10 year, it takes the full
Right.
$1 million out. It just kind of compounds the tax problem, if you will, potentially.
Right. Right. And we've got some strategies to talk about for you as the IRA owner in terms of
Hmm.
mitigating these issues for your beneficiaries. Usually where we're dealing with this is when we have so far is when we have someone inheriting an IRA under
Right.
these new rules. You've got to be much more strategic about when and how you take that income. You can potentially, if the decedent was not of required minimum distribution age, you don't necessarily have to take a required minimum distribution now, but
Right.
that means all of that income is going to be due in the 10th year.
Right. Yep.
So, just from a planning standpoint, we're usually looking at it trying to figure out what the most tax efficient way for
Yeah.
someone to take that,
Right.
and I'm kind of setting this up to explain the strategies from the other end that we're going to talk about in a minute from if you're the IRA owner. But I would also end that by saying I've yet to have an IRA beneficiary say, "Oh shoot, Dad left me a big tax bill."
Yeah.
So
As I always like to say, if somebody wants to leave me any amount of money, I'll gladly pay
I'll pay the
taxes on
taxes.
it.
Yeah, yeah, right, right, right,
And that's kind of one of as far as considerations go. Before we get into the strategy, I think it's important to think about this, because sometimes we get so
yeah,
wrapped up and worried about these things that we're hearing on the internet that we do all these irrational planning things that don't
right,
really make any sense, right?
yeah,
And so,
yeah. You've got to
like,
think about what's important.
yeah.
Yeah,
So, and what I was going to say there is, how important is tax mitigation to your overall financial strategy,
right,
right? Like, are
right.
you really worried about what your kid's tax bill is going to be, or are you just going to be happy that,
Yeah,
if you're one of those people that just says whatever's left over goes to the kids and they can deal with it, it's not all that important to me whether it's pre-tax or after tax or what their taxes are. My goal isn't to maximize what my beneficiaries have, and so really thinking about like how important that is.
yes.
Now, that being said, just in general, I think it makes sense to at least have the conversation or think about like what your tax rate is and what theirs is likely to be, and do some
Hmm.
planning around that no matter what. But I don't think it's the end all be all, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You don't want to let the tax tail wag the decision making dog, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. Well, I also think just in general of like projecting out, and as we go through and create retirement plans for people, we're kind of, cluing them into like how much is probably going to be left over and where it's going to be,
Right.
and just thinking about like you may be making, in your mind, this might be a way bigger problem than it is, depending on what your strategies are and things like that, how much you'll have in your IRA.
Yeah.
And just
Yeah.
going back to your other point too, Dave, about like if someone inherits $1 million IRA and waits till the 10th year, well, that's going to grow too, right? And so
Right.
if it grows by 7% a year, $1 million in year 10 is going to be $2 million, and you're going to have an even bigger tax bill potentially, right?
Sure. Yeah. I think again, horrible problems to have.
Yeah, right. But things, and you can just kind of see where a lot of this stuff is coming out, and where you're seeing it in the news, and why, you really need to kind of think about it from a couple different aspects. Once you kind of get your general philosophy around like how important is this, how much, you know, mental energy do we want, how much money do we want to spend trying to like figure this out or pay taxes now for our kids later, like all of those things go into it. And then kind of coming from the standpoint of what do we do now, right? Like what are some of those strategies to potentially mitigate some of these taxes for our potential beneficiaries? So our first strategy is increasing the number of beneficiaries,
Yep.
right? So have more kids.
Right.
No, but honestly, think about it in terms of like how much. Like, let's say you've got 3 kids, and you're starting to do the math, and you're thinking like that's a lot of money. Well, also, and a lot of parents, a lot of people that we sit with right now, the kind of the general consensus is, well, just give it to my kids, and then they can decide what they want to do for their kids, right?
Yes.
Which is fine, and I'm not trying to tell people not to do it that way, but another way to think about it is, what happens if we include that grandchildren generation in there, if we
And
carve out
name
a
them.
portion for them, and then they then have their own 10-year schedule, their own tax rates, have less money. And so, if you give it to the parents, they will have to take it out and pay the taxes to then give it to the kids. And
Right.
so, in certain instances, adding the grandkids for a portion of that you want to go to them can potentially help some of this by
Yeah.
spreading out the number
Yeah.
of beneficiaries and spreading out the tax brackets.
Like just about everything in this kind of planning, there's pros and cons.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you've got to think through how you feel about beneficiaries of next generation receiving that kind of money in those
Yeah.
instances. I generally think people worry about that too much, but
Yeah.
on the other hand, that's a personal decision. So that's kind of the downside of it, is the
Mm-hmm.
control.
Well, and there's the other aspect too of like, I don't want anybody to listen to this and go out and like name their 10 grandkids who are all under the age of 18, because that has its own set of problems, right?
Yeah,
So like you have to consider all of the things like, can this person handle it? What happens if I name them? If they're under 18,
right.
there's other rules and things that potentially make it more complex than maybe you want to.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of things that go into that, but certainly like if you've got, your kids are going to be 60 and your grandkids are going to be 35, maybe then you feel good about them getting a portion of it. Like those are certainly the
right.
conversations that you need to have and things you can think about.
And I kind of, as an aside, and we didn't really have this in our outline, but I would encourage people to think about your overall estate, not just your IRAs,
Yeah.
and think about it in terms of, okay, who's in the best tax position to inherit the IRA versus potentially Roth assets, after tax
Mm-hmm.
assets, money from selling the house,
Yeah.
things like that. If you think about where different people in your overall estate would be in terms of
Yeah.
their tax situation, leave the IRA to the people with the least overall tax burden.
Right.
And I, and as another thing to add to that is if charities are part of your
Mm-hmm.
estate plan, they definitely are the best ones to inherit portions of your IRA. And a lot of
Yeah.
people, I still see that ignored a lot.
That's a great point, because I don't, we've also had this change where, estate planning used to be like, let's get around the estate tax and let's,
Yeah,
figure out how to, because that's a tax bill that nobody wants to pay.
right.
And so now that the, exemption for that is 15 million for individuals and 30 million for
Yeah,
couples,
yeah.
estate tax isn't really crossing most people's minds, but
No,
we have this other problem of the income
income
tax, right?
tax. Right,
And so
right,
thinking of it exactly what you said, like our charities evolved, how does a charity inherit this asset? What kind of taxes do they
right.
pay? Do I have one kid that's a doctor, a neurosurgeon making a bunch of money, and the other kid's a social worker that's making no money? Like we can give them different pieces of the puzzle and they can
Yeah,
end up in the same place,
yeah.
even if, and so really thinking through some of those decisions and how they impact, I think does make a lot of sense. And it's, it's something that with, we aren't seeing, or that piece is getting missed a little bit in a lot of
Hmm.
this. And so certainly something that people should consider and think about. Another one, this that is kind of interesting as well, and this again, a lot of these strategies don't necessarily make sense for everybody. For
No,
some people in the right situation, it
no.
certainly does, and this is
Yeah,
one of those. Like, it probably doesn't make sense for most people, but
yeah.
certainly something you might think, and that is, if you and your spouse both have similar large IRAs and are of similar age, you might consider not, bypassing the spouse at
Hmm.
first death, meaning going right to the kids as
Right,
opposed to going to your spouse. Because what happens is you get to then have a separate 10-year window, as opposed to if it goes to the spouse first and then everything goes to the
right,
kids, they have one 10-year window. So,
right.
unless you're planning on dying at the same exact time, which, does happen quite frequently, but you can never
No, but
predict. It
yeah,
may potentially save you some taxes and
yeah,
give your kids a little bit more ability to control those distributions than otherwise
right.
would.
But
But obviously,
again,
there's some downfalls to that
yeah,
strategy,
the
right?
downside being obviously then if the surviving spouse, like a long-term care situation or something, needs those assets, that's a hard thing to claw back.
Yeah, you got to be real sure that you're not going to need those
Yeah,
for something in the
yeah.
future, and so and thinking through like what that looks like, and making sure you have enough, and that makes sense in your situation.
Thinking about it with my planner hat on, and this hasn't come up with clients too much, but you could also divide the IRAs.
Sure.
You could,
Yeah.
if you think, well, a good chunk of mine could go straight to my kids without my wife needing it. There's
Right.
nothing that says you can't name
Yeah.
them all, as primary with your spouse's 50% instead of
Right.
100%, or
Yeah. For sure.
or divide the accounts, or whatever.
Yeah, but like you said, you want to make real sure that you're not going to need that. It's definitely got to be something that you're not going to need before you actually implement a strategy like that.
I love saving taxes, though. It's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, then it goes back to, one of the estate planners that I know said it best is like sometimes we freak out so much about things like, that are that, the example in estate planning is like making sure that I look poor so that I can qualify for Medicaid
Right.
when and realistically, you're putting yourself in a place that you don't want to
Yeah.
be. If you use that money to maintain your health and be in better shape, maybe you don't go into that
Yeah.
facility to begin with,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to making yourself poor and you end up in a place that you didn't want to.
Right.
And so it is kind of that similar thing, right? Like you don't want to give away all your money because you're worried about taxes. You got to make sure you take care of yourself first and you have enough, and then you can start worrying
Yeah.
about the tax bill, or you know what
Yep.
I mean?
Yep. It's all about balance as usual.
Yeah. So the next one in here is something that I know you and I are in the midst of trying to finalize a lot this year, and that is Roth conversions.
Yes.
And this kind of goes into that earlier consideration of what's your tax rate versus what your kids' potential tax rates is going to be, right? And so
Yes.
if you're in retirement, you don't have a ton of income, maybe you're in the 12% or the 22% tax bracket, you got the neurosurgeon kid who's out there in the 32% tax
Right.
bracket, right?
Right. And accumulating their own
Yeah,
IRA and
right. Yeah.
401k assets too.
So there's
Yeah.
some considerations there as far as if I pay taxes now, it can potentially do a conversion. Um, then it can potentially save my kid taxes, right? And so then we're
Right.
kind of factoring in what their taxes would be. And again, this goes back to what the earlier point we made. Like, if anybody wants to give me a large sum of money, I'll happily pay the taxes on it, at no matter what rate I'm paying taxes at. But if it is important to you and it is something you want to think about, Roth conversions make sense where we're taking pre-tax IRA money, paying the taxes now, converting it to a Roth where we never have to pay the taxes. And then when your kids inherit it, they still have a 10-year window of which to take it out, but they
Yeah.
don't pay any taxes on no matter what amount that is when they
Yeah.
do take it out. And so it kind of saves them the tax bill. One of the strategies here too is if you're sitting there on the other shoe and you have parents and you are potentially going to inherit that IRA, you might go to them and say, "Hey, mom, dad, I know that you're in the in a lower tax bill than I am right now. Why don't we
Yes.
consider doing some conversions? I'll pay the taxes.
Yeah.
I'll gift you the money to pay the taxes
Yeah.
because it's going to end up saving me a bunch of money
Yeah.
in
For
5, 10 years
sure.
from now, right?"
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
just like with everything, there's some concerns with that as far as, if mom or dad end up needing that money, you might gift them money and not ever actually inherit that. Or if they decide that they don't like you anymore, you
Sure.
change beneficiaries, right? Like there's definitely some things you want to think about. But it could potentially, if you're not worried about that stuff, it could potentially,
Sure.
save you a bunch of taxes by
Yeah.
paying at your
Yeah.
parents' rate as
Yeah.
opposed to your own.
Yeah. It's it's interesting how too I keep thinking in my head like a lot of this comes back to the idea of being able to talk intergenerationally about the overall financial picture. If you're serious about making this work, I think if we ask our average client what tax bracket their kids are in, they're going to automatically tell us, they're probably in a high tax bracket, but they
Right.
probably don't really know, you
Yeah.
know,
Right.
and And if you don't have those conversations, a lot of this is just guesswork.
Yeah.
And also, I've had a couple situations in my career where the parents were sure that doing something, I believe it was around, um, it's more around spending than Roth
Hmm.
conversion, or and they just were like, the parents were like, oh no, that's for the kids, and the kids got involved in the conversation and were like, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Yeah.
I don't, we don't need that. We don't want that. Go do this thing or buy
Right.
this thing.
Yeah.
I don't remember the specifics, but
Well, it's so true. It happens all the time. Like we talk about this with just in estate planning in general, but like having that conversation with your kids and figuring
yeah,
out, like, we live in this world where nobody wants to talk about money
or death. Yeah,
or death, and
yeah,
this is basically talking about both of those things.
right.
But it can solve so many problems if you have that family conversation around, like, here's what we're thinking
Yeah,
about, here's what we're looking at, where are you guys at, how does this potentially impact you, how can we make this the best situation for all parties involved. And those conversations just don't happen a lot of times, and they can solve a lot of issues and get a much clearer path on a lot of this stuff. And so I would highly encourage you, if you're listening, to have those family conversations,
yeah,
because a lot of different things can come out of those for the good, for sure.
yeah.
And the other strategy we have down here, just thinking about, is just strategic beneficiary designations. We talked about this a little bit with naming charities and things like that. But just thinking of it in terms of actual beneficiaries, right? And so if you have two kids and they're your primary beneficiaries, you really have three beneficiaries, and that is your two kids in the IRS, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is just basically a funny, quirky way of saying, like, pay attention to this stuff,
Yeah.
because it does potentially have an impact. And make sure to explain it to the kids too, right?
Well, yeah, I remember talking to an advisor years ago who, when he would do a annual net worth statement for his clients, would actually put the after tax value of all their retirement assets,
Yeah,
um, as kind of an interesting way of reframing how they thought
sure.
about it.
Yeah.
I thought it was a little extreme, but yeah, that mindset of, okay, how much do you want that third beneficiary to get, and how
Hmm.
important is it to you to to mitigate that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Probably my least favorite strategy, but one that I'm going to talk about anyways, because I know it's out there, because I've heard it sold to people. And that is swapping your IRA assets for life insurance, or basically taking a distribution from your IRA to pay premiums on life insurance. And the thought process there being, my life insurance premium goes to my beneficiaries tax free. And so it
hmm,
can help pay the taxes on the IRA that's left over. And so there's some thought process to that being a really great asset for inheriting, which is true. But I also would encourage you to look at the math and the
right,
unflexibility of that when you're making that decision.
right,
Don't just get sold the dream by the insurance guy. And I think oftentimes, and we haven't really talked about it, but just like general brokerage accounts are great vehicles for transferring assets as opposed to an IRA,
yeah,
because you get a stepped up
yeah,
cost basis. And so, there's some considerations on both of those things that you really have to dig into.
yeah. I struggle with that one. I find, the maybe the best way to think about the insurance answer is, that's great if you die unexpectedly early.
Yeah, for
Then
sure.
yes, that would be a
Yeah,
good strategy. If you live a normal or longer life expectancy, not so much.
yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
you would have been better off investing those assets otherwise. But
Well,
that's
and it kind of goes back to your goal, right? Like, is your
right,
goal to have as much money as possible for your kids? Then yeah, you might want to have a big life insurance policy,
right,
right?
right,
If it's not, then I
right.
wouldn't worry so much about the life insurance policy, and to some degree the taxes. I wouldn't just think that you have to start doing all these things or doing some of these things just because you're worried about taxes for your kids someday, right? Like if
Right.
that's not your number one priority,
Right.
then I wouldn't worry about it, right? Maybe
Right.
you're thinking, hey, and this is one of we actually did a book review on this book, and it's one of the big things that kind of popped out for me, and that was the Die with Zero book.
Oh,
And
yes.
just kind of that consideration of like you're gonna spend all this time and energy saving taxes for your kids and saving money and making sure there's inheritance for them, and by the time they actually get it, they're not going to need it anymore, right?
Yes.
And where you could have like helped them put a down payment on a house or something that was actually important to them when you were alive, instead of
Yeah.
paying a future tax bill for them, and that may have gone a much longer, better way for you and your
Right.
plan, what you actually wanted to
Right.
do. And I'm not saying one is right over the
Well,
other. I just think you need to make those considerations of like what you
yeah.
actually want to do and what's important to
Well,
you.
and so much more we could say about that, but the other thing that comes to mind is how much more you get to enjoy it then.
Yeah,
No,
for sure.
you're not going to know, you're not going to have any joy from the grave
Yeah, right.
over what you left,
Exactly.
or how it's handled.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, good. I think that's a good way to wrap it up there.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have other questions about stretch IRAs, inherited IRAs, happy to have those conversations. Check out our website at info@srbadvisors.com to schedule a time to chat. And with that, Mr. Shotwell, thank you kindly, sir.
Thank
We'll
you.
do it again soon.
You bet.
Thank you for joining us for another chat about your retirement and finances. Please hit that subscribe button. You can also contact us at srbadvisors.com or email us at info@srbadvisors.com. See you next time on Kitchen Table Finance.
This is a Zedia Media production.